Again tonight, strikes on Kiev. Look at these images. Russia has launched a drone attack on the Ukrainian capital, causing 3 deaths and 10 injuries. Does this concretely reshuffle the cards of the end of the conflict?
Russia's bombing of civilian residential buildings changes nothing, as they have been doing this for 3 years. Children died last night in the typically better protected Kiev region. So unfortunately, it's actually usual. Unfortunately, we're used to it. 200,000 buildings are impacted or destroyed. The United Nations reports over 25,000 civilian deaths in the free zones. The Russians are acting as if no negotiations took place, disregarding recent events.
Volodymyr Zelensky convened his military cabinet in Kharkiv, a city near the border with Russia. Why have we been seeing him more and more on the ground these past few days?
Today, the war continues. It's a reality. We tend to think that only the political dimension exists. The war rages on in Kharkiv, a city under constant bombardment and hovering bombs. Since late last year, Ukrainians have had the right to retaliate against attacks on their soil by striking Russia. The first occurrence was in May 2024, when the Russian front collapsed. However, the front remains unstable. Russians still hold a small area in northern Kharkiv. So there too, the fighting continues. The president had visited many fronts, including Kharkiv, one of the country's largest cities. Despite not having been there recently, it was crucial for him to show support in the region.
He also went to
Pokrovsk,
city that the Russians have been trying to capture for several months. How are the Ukrainians resisting, and by what means in this area?
Across the entire front, the Russians are progressing very slowly. I remind 2024, they've advanced 4,000 square kilometers, a third of French departments, while losing 400,000 men. At the current speed, it will take them another 2.5 to 3 years to capture the Donetsk area. So we are dealing with an incredible slowness. I've visited the area south of Pokrovsk 4 times since last August. It's notably the brigade that was formed in France and of Kiev,
Who has
been equipped and trained in France, who arrived from mid-December. And if we look from mid-January, the Russians have stopped progressing, and the well-equipped Ukrainians are occasionally making small assaults. And what makes the difference? When, in the south zone, you have 18 Caesars, 21 tanks, Leopard, the VABs for safe movement, and AMX-10, which are also French artillery. Well, yes, the Russians can't advance. When there is mass, it's necessary. The amount and quality of weaponry supplied to the formations is the key question. Ukrainians are grateful for the information and materials provided, proving that the Russians can no longer advance when faced with this.
So you're saying that nothing has been decided yet?
If there was a sufficient amount of material on the entire front, enough to retake territory, yes. The Ukrainians have the will to liberate their territory and prevent Russia from advancing. If the entire front had the same armament density as what France provided to Ukraine in this small area, there is no doubt Russia will never be able to conquer even the Donbass. The problem today is that France alone can provide what is necessary for this small portion of the front, but not all allies are making the same effort. And the great ally, the United States, of course, they have stopped making big announcements since Trump's announcement.
The concern is mainly on the side of Kursk. Listen to what the Americans are saying, and especially the chief negotiator, Steve Witkoff. Today,
Putin asked me during our meeting what do I do? Ukrainian soldiers who do not want to surrender in the areas where we surround them, I kill them. How do I get them to surrender? I would be happy not to kill everyone and to see the soldiers waving the white flag if I can.
Get there.
The Ukrainian soldiers.
fighting in Kursk in this Russian region have described scenes worthy of a horror movie. As they withdrew from the front lines, what are your field reports? Steve Witkoff is not there, but you are? Went there, so not to...
I have contacts still fighting there today. 2 close ones died in the area, so I have significant feedback from the ground. Initially, the Russians persisted in their advancement efforts. At one point, the United States temporarily ceased providing intelligence to Ukraine. And there, for almost about 10 days, the Ukrainians realized that they were dealing with the same targets daily using kamikaze drones and artillery. Some of the information came from the Americans, and that they did not know, and they discovered it on this occasion. Once the Russian artillery is in position, we can no longer destroy it because its location is unknown. And so they had difficulties in the north, and there they have a setback. That's when
the intelligence was cut off, exactly. However, afterwards...
From the moment the intelligence was restored, no more problems. They returned to a normal situation, but they were asked to retreat. They were asked to retreat without leaving a mine. That is to say, in essence, they had been guaranteed that there was security, that there was a kind of you. You remember at the time when no one had been abandoned by the Russians? The Ukrainians were compelled not to pursue, destroy, or cut off the retreating Russians by demolishing bridges. At the time, the United States feared Russia would use an atomic bomb on Ukrainian soil. So apparently they were told in the same way that you let the Russians go, the Russians will let you withdraw. And to withdraw, it was a requirement of the Americans. Certainly the Russians told them to start negotiating a ceasefire. We want to reclaim the city of Suja, so they retreated towards Suja, and contrary to their promise, obviously, the Russians bombed the Ukrainians who were withdrawing. That is, they lacked the fuel to move their heavy equipment back, for example. They had to abandon equipment on the spot because they were under fire while attempting to leave on foot. After Suja, it lessened. The border was less than 10 kilometers away, so they could have fully withdrawn in a 2-hour walk, but they abandoned strong defensive positions and they didn't mind the areas they were leaving, which, according to the soldiers on the spot, would obviously have slowed down the Russian advance. They have stabilized on a very small, insignificant portion of the front. It's more symbolic now, but militarily, in any case, they still own a part of the territory. It's just like a small thorn in the Russians' shoe, but it has no military value anymore. But even if...
It's a very small piece of territory. You
say it.
It's symbolic.
Especially before...
these famous negotiations. Can they keep it, this territory? There is...
The objective was to compel the Russians to relocate their army, which had a significant impact, although there was no long-term commitment to maintain it. You have 60,000 to 70,000 soldiers who are no longer on the other fronts. I was in August when the Ukrainians made this attack on the Kursk area, and I was in the Pokrovsk area precisely. They blessed this attack because overnight there were no more ammunition coming. The Russian side had exhausted their manpower and diverted all heavy equipment to another part of the front. So the fact that the Russians took almost 8 months to retake these 1,200 square kilometers, it means that there are 1,200 square kilometers of Ukraine that are not additionally invaded. So it's true that it's diverting the front. What the Ukrainians are doing in Belgorod is exactly the same thing. Yes, you have put forces in race, but ultimately in Belgorod it's still just as weak. So let's attack on Belgorod and force the Russians to put really solid troops on the entire border, which is what the Ukrainians are doing. And that is to strip the rest of the front. You said it.
It would be the new Russian drone tactics that would have tipped the Battle of Kursk.
A strategy
of using fiber optic drones that cut off enemy supply lines. Look at what's being said in the Wall Street Journal, which says that for weeks, few supply vehicles were able to reach the troops in Kursk province because the Russians had put the roads within reach of explosive drone teams, leaving Ukrainian stocks so low that some soldiers were melting snow to get drinking water. How did it happen? When discussing a horrific scene, we are completely immersed in it. In fact, tangibly,
there was only one road that allowed to reach Ukraine in the front zones, and this road, the Russians had regained control of up to 1,200 square kilometers of territory, but then their controlled area dropped below 500 square kilometers. And there were both the artillery and the kamikaze drones that allowed them to hit the Russian kamikaze drones. Without the optical fiber, they were scrambled. It had no interest. Everything the Russians used in the area was fiber optic, so they still had less than in other areas, and only a proportion of them were usable at night. So roughly everything that passed during the day, they really had to drive very fast, and they were getting drones from the right, from the left. It was really exploding. I've watched videos that clearly show numerous vehicles being destroyed in quick succession, and at night, it was their only way to get around. The Ukrainians had set up small infrared cameras with infrared projectors, allowing them to drive at night undetected by the Russians, and those are the simplest equipment one can know, but they even put them on their 4x4 when they were moving around. Because yes, really, drones, that's the big pain. And when you have your single supply route within shooting range, it's a big difficulty. So I didn't have stories about water, but I had stories about gasoline. They ran out of gasoline. Without gasoline, you'll obviously say that your heavy vehicles can no longer be used normally. That's why some heavy vehicles couldn't be repatriated. They had to be abandoned in the field. The Russians are going to display them as trophies in their homes today. But overall, what is light, especially small drones, kamikazes, etc., they could continue routing them into 4K, allowing Ukrainians to persist.
To show inventiveness, since they are still hitting Russian territory today in Belgorod. And a few days ago, quite spectacularly, on the Russian airbase of Engels 2, with drones and long Neptune missiles, how do they actually plan these deep attacks? First of all, they know
the infrastructure since the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was Ukraine and Russia, so they know these large bases. By checking Google Maps, you can easily locate the main bases. The takeoffs from Engels, these are the takeoffs that are going to bomb and hit civilians, as we saw last night. It's hundreds of missiles that are sent each month by the planes taking off from this Engels base. Tupolev 95, Tupolev 160, etc. And what's interesting is that we can see the effect of this bombing that was carried out on the city. And we see here this mushroom cloud that is visible for miles and miles around. It's between, according to the size of the explosion, which was analyzed by specialists, between 50 and 60 Russian missiles would have been destroyed. It wasn't the runway that was targeted, it was the ammunition depot that was right next to it. Once again, the effectiveness of the Ukrainian systems is evident. Do you remember the boat, the Moskva ship, which was sunk? It was an anti-ship missile, this Neptune missile. They have made a ground-to-ground version, which can go presumably now up to 800 or 1,000 kilometers in range. They fly at a very low altitude of 497 miles Trich. The Ukrainians send drones at 250, 186 miles H, which the Russians are unable to intercept. But when it's real cruise missiles, a little bit like the French Scalp, which goes even further, we can clearly see the results indeed. And the more time passes, the more the Ukrainians will have this type of weapons. I know Ukrainian retired engineers who have returned to work, developing a missile with a 30 miles range, so we know they can retreat much further. But the day their bomber planes will have to take off 3,000 kilometers instead of 1,000 kilometers, logically, they will have the ability to carry out fewer bombing missions in a day. The Russians as well
have learned from the Ukrainians about the
ground. They
particularly use Zala drones, Russian reconnaissance drones with a long endurance between 6 to 7 hours of flight, developed to provide accurate information to artillery. We see it here, Defense Express, which says in the context of the fight against anti-aircraft first-person view drones, the Russians have started to integrate artificial vision into the wings on their Zala drone, thanks to which their devices learn to automatically perform evasive turns.
That changes.
What concretely? In fact, the
Zala drone found at the base was relatively old, having been used in Syria during 2016 to 2017, along with the Orlandi drones. They also improved with Ukraine, as they were deployed there as early as 2014. It's not a true novelty, but they understood the interest of these drones, and Ukraine has developed a methodology to destroy these observation drones by sending these small kamikaze drones that we see in very, very large quantities hitting the ground. Well, they make them under a kind of drone carrier. We have aircraft carriers. Well, they have drone carriers. They ascend to 30 miles and release their small drones, and the drone will go to meet these observation drones to collide with them, to be able to destroy them. And so by losing hundreds and hundreds of drones, more than 1,500 proven Russian observation drones destroyed with this method of voluntary contact in flight, the Russians have implemented a method where on the roof, on top of the fuselage, they put a small camera, exactly the same as we have on our phones. And from the moment there is a drone coming at them, they are going to do what is called an evasion. That is to say, the drone will drop a little bit lower without the pilot needing to do it. So that's why we talk about artificial intelligence. It's an automatic system to avoid the Ukrainian method of deliberate collision. A new drone
is also in Paris this week on the Ukrainian side. You mentioned that's a significant development, a drone designed to counter Russian helicopters. Why is it so revolutionary? Until now, the
Ukrainians had small drones with which they tried to collide, especially with observation drones. And then little by little, they developed drones that could destroy low-cost cruise missiles, also known as Shahed. And they had made several attempts to try to collide with helicopters. In other words, a helicopter traveling at 155.3 miles H is carrying a small kamikaze drone on a mission. Here is this image. We see here we are in a kamikaze drone and we are trying to intercept. Here, it's a Kamov 52. It's missed because the Kamov 52 is going too fast. Images show attempts to destroy helicopters in flight using a 300 euros kamikaze drone. Well, obviously, it would be interesting if he could get there. The main issue is that these helicopters are flying too fast compared to the Ukrainian kamikaze drone. And the second issue is that the blast, the helicopter's rotor was tipping them over. And so the new drone that the Russians have unveiled, because this is information that comes from the Russians themselves, who say, darn, the Ukrainians completed this development. It's a drone that goes faster and is designed not to be disturbed by the rotor wash. So we can expect that in the coming weeks, we will start to have Russian helicopters falling again, including several kilometers deep without needing to approach within shooting distance from the Ukrainian poles. The Air Force Wamas.
The Ukrainian Air Force received a new batch of F-16 planes this week.
They will
serve what purpose in the coming days? For now, the
Ukrainians primarily use their modern planes, namely F-16As and Mirages. 2000, it's to stay in the rear to intercept Russian long-range cruise missiles and kamikaze drones. There are two potential actions for these planes: is to do bombing or serve as mobile air defense of theater. That is to say, you have plenty of cities that are not protected. Besides Kiev, last night there was not enough protection system to intercept everything. And so you have these fighter planes, the F-16, which will be able to take off. That there are anti-aircraft missiles, it has its own radar to lock onto its target. And with the air-to-air missiles it has under its wings, it will be able to destroy up to 6 missiles on a single flight. Adding 4 to 6 planes in one night gives the possibility to destroy about 20 additional Russian cruise missiles. And it's actually a race between the Russian missile firing capacity and the Ukrainians' ability to defend themselves. Unless we provide them with Patriot systems or French health on each of their cities, they have F-16S and Mirage 2000-0S, which can quickly intercept. And we can hope that from the moment they have between 30 and 50, they will have a sufficient mass of maneuvers to also leave. Participate in missions against the Russian lines and therefore do air-to-ground attacks. But for now, this is not yet their main mission. The question of the
fighters is paramount, since we have seen that there was a certain form of dependence these last few days. With certain threats on the F-35, particularly from the Americans, is there a real risk of blackmail from the Americans on particularly the spare parts that would be used for the F-35? So it's proven?
Already, because it means they have the ability to reduce the effectiveness of the planes remotely. That was confirmed by the United Arab Emirates when they were looking to buy this plane. Israel had said it's not a big deal. If the Emirates buy the F-35, the United States can reduce its stealth capabilities. But the Emirates
they diversified their fleet from the beginning, which is why they have
even completely cancelled their desire to buy. It's a $20 billion contract, and they bought the Rafale. It's a very good thing for them and for us too. But so does that also mean that all the countries that rely on the F-35 can see their planes degraded? The diplomatic pressure extends beyond the F-35. Recall the events of 2003. When the United States wanted to involve us in their Iraq war, the Americans had stopped supplying us with catapult spare parts for 2 years. And it was really to punish us for having, at the United Nations, been against them a little more, and we would have had our aircraft carrier that no longer worked. We have other instances where we heavily rely on the Americans, such as Operation Armatan in Libya. 2011, the refuelers, they were American. We only have around 15, but new ones are arriving. However, we still depend on American infrastructure. And one last example, the Scalp missiles. And when we wanted to sell Rafale planes to Egypt, the Americans said, "Ah, no, the Scalp missile. There is this little component that is American. I forbid you to supply the Scalp missiles." However, it was one of the main elements of this sale. And the Scalp, it's very recent that we managed to remove the American components and that we are finally totally sovereign in the use of this weapon for us and our allies, including Ukraine, to whom we provided Scalp missiles with United States components. This meant the Americans could restrict the Ukrainians from using it as desired and as we would have preferred them to be able to use it. And
according to Xavier Teidelman, the F-35As are crucial for most of these countries under the American nuclear umbrella. Eric Trappier, chief executive officer of Dassault Aviation, clearly expressed his views in a Le Journal du Dimanche column. Today, some countries like Canada are putting their orders on hold regarding the
famous F-35.
Does that mean they won't buy it? I don't know. Is there a way? For countries that have decided to equip themselves with the American nuclear umbrella to replace these F-35s as easily. So to keep...
There is absolutely no choice but to buy the American F-35 atomic weapon. When Germany wanted to rank the F-35 below the F-18, the United States said the F-18 would no longer be acceptable. You must purchase our costly plane, which has numerous development challenges. So for Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany and Italy, there really is no other alternative. Conversely, Canada has no need for the F-35 as it does not depend on nuclear military infrastructure. The other possibility then, diplomatically, there will be a lot to discuss, is that Germany agrees to buy the Rafale and that we agree to provide the French nuclear weapon. Because instead of depending on the Americans and being with the American button, it is still Trump who would give the order to the Germans to use the nuclear weapon. The strategic interests of Germany and the United States are less divergent than those of Germany and France. So if France wanted to sell its nuclear deterrence, like the Americans sell their deterrence to these countries, yes, that's a potential. And then other countries like Canada, which we just talked about, they have already bought some planes. So they could buy 1836 F-35s, but cancel the last 50 and buy Rafale. For example, like Greece, which has a dual fleet of Rafale F-35, especially since Donald
Trump does not plan to stop American dependence here as he announces this. It's a day
Important. We have presented the best fighter plane in the world. I believe that it's the best given the criteria it has met. It will undoubtedly be completely obsolete in 5 years, but that's the game, I guess. There is no an airplane designed and manufactured like this before. We will have it by 2 years. We are going to start manufacturing very soon. The technology of the F-47 airplane is an incredible feat of engineering, giving us a 10-year lead over other countries. There has never been anything like it.
The 47th United States president, our viewers will have understood, but what is this new device? It's the first
officialization of the sixth-generation airplane, the sixth-generation fighter plane, whose prototype was called the Next-Generation Air Dominance. The program was formalized in the United States about 10 years ago, and the first flight of the prototype took place 5 years ago. So ultimately, they are just formalizing what already existed. It's Trump-style marketing. The timing of commissioning was supposed to be 2030, but we are industrializing it today. The first delivery is in 2 or 3 years, and then the time to admit it to active service. The timing is exactly what was planned. And why is this announcement now? It's because the Chinese presented their sixth-generation plane in flight last November. So it's simply us responding anyway. It's been flying for 5 years. We didn't show it because it's too discreet, but we are not. France and Europe are still in the race for hydrogen-powered planes. Aiming for 2040 to 2045 work is ongoing. Thank you, Xavier.
Titelman, thank you for being my guest tonight. Stay with us as we will soon experience a special moment together.